what they expected. And there was such a mood of optimism in Rabat because they really thought that this would be another January 25th moment. They thought that they were building a critical mass. They had these two sit-ins, and they had convinced themselves, somewhat delusionally I would say, that this was going to be the end of the coup. That just through their sheer force of numbers and sheer force of will, they would be able to break the coup. Obviously that did not happen, and I think for some people, it came as something of a shock. Now, I think then we see a certain kind of naivete, but also I saw this in the days leading up to July 3rd. I remember talking to Brotherhood guys, some of Morsi's advisors, on July 1st, July 2nd, until the very last moment, and they had maybe convinced themselves that that the coup wasn't going to happen, this idea that Sisi at the end of the day was not going to betray them. And there's a lot of reasons for that, I think. Sisi totally played them. I mean, it's just remarkable when you think about it in retrospect. But I think some of these Brotherhood guys, they really had, because Sisi used to pray with them in Jama'ah on a regular basis. Sisi prayed 5 times a day. He fasted with them on Mondays and Thursdays. He seemed like a really devout guy. And they actually, and because the Brotherhood this is where the conflict or the tensions between being a haraka and a hizb, you see the tensions. Because in one hand, they do da'wah. That's what the Brotherhood, that's their original core focus. So when they see someone like Sisi, who shows a real interest in religion, they feel, oh, deep down, he's inclined to our views. We can bring him slowly. Let's bring him closer to us. This is the approach of da'wah, but this is not the way you do politics. And you see how that clashes and leads to some very serious mistakes in those final days before the coup. Now, I think what some in the Brotherhood failed to really appreciate, and I think they're starting to appreciate it more, but in those early days in August, September, and October, there was still a hope. And maybe part of this was them trying to convince themselves, maybe some of them really believed it, it's hard to tell, but really believed that it was just a matter of months, or if maybe a year, that the regime was going to break quickly. I think there were 3 reasons why that was very unlikely. So, and this applies to the current situation as well. And this is where I think it's really important to be realistic about what to expect in the coming months and years. So Sisi, I think, has 4 distinctive advantages. 1, the willingness to kill, and this is where political learning becomes very important. So the lesson of the Arab Spring for Arab autocrats in general was not to offer more reform, it was precisely the opposite. You don't give an inch, you don't concede anything to your opponents, you use as much force as necessary. That was a lesson learned by the Bahraini leadership, the Syrians, the Libyans, because they looked at Ben Ali and Mubarak and said, they were soft. They gave up too quickly. Why did Mubarak fight to the very end? So that's unfortunately, so political learning can be good, but it can also be bad. And the lesson here, and this is precisely what this new regime is applying, it's a zero tolerance approach to dissent. They believe that if you let the opposition have any space, the opposition will become emboldened and you won't be able to stop their march. So the idea, you cut it at the root. And so that does present some problems, because if you have a military apparatus and...
Could you repeat the 4?
No, that was the first, that's just number 1.
That's number 1.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through each of the 4. Yeah.
The worst yet to come.
What, sorry?
The worst yet to come.
Yeah. So, because this is a very key thing when you look at transitions, is the military and security apparatus willing to kill their own people? And this is how a lot of regimes break, because the senior ranks of the military can't get the rank and file to shoot their own fellow countrymen. So this is a very key test. How much killing can they actually do before you start to see objections in the military? I think very unfortunately so far we see the military still pretty unified, and certainly at the highest levels there's tensions, but we don't see any signs of real splits emerging. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, number two, regional support. This is perhaps the most hostile environment imaginable for democratization in Egypt and the broader Middle East for a couple reasons. You have Saudi Arabia and the UAE that are adopting a very muscular role and are being very aggressive. They sense a power vacuum in the region and they're stepping in, and they're willing to put $15–20 billion plus into supporting the Sisi government, remarkable numbers, and they're willing to commit more and more. And they're willing to put pressure on other countries to follow suit. I mean, even when it comes to African countries that have to vote in the AU, the African Union, about whether to suspend Egypt's membership. So they're going all out on the political and financial side. Not just that, the US and the EU have been neutralized. I'm not going to say, I'm not one of these people who's going to say that the US backed the coup. That's a different conversation. I don't believe the US did enough to stop the coup, and those are two different things. Because we do know, and I know from people who were briefing Hagel, that they were telling Sisi in those final days, maybe this whole coup thing won't be the best idea, but the problem is they weren't clear about what the consequences would be. They didn't say to Sisi, if you go forward with this coup, we're going to suspend military aid. It'll be interesting. I don't know, maybe it wouldn't have made a difference, but they didn't even try. There wasn't serious pressure put. But more importantly, post-coup, you see the U.S. becoming, to one degree or another, complicit in the post-coup order and establishing and maintaining that post-coup order. There was barely any pressure put on Sisi in the first couple months after the coup, or maybe right before Rabat. There were some efforts at mediation, and they were very close to reaching a confidence-building agreement. And there's a great article that probably some of you have read by Kirkpatrick in the New York Times, where he lays out the state of negotiations until the very last moment. And apparently, Bill Burns was under the Deputy Undersecretary of State, was under the impression that there was a deal. But at the very last moment, the Egyptian regime or military backed out of it, and some people speculate, maybe more than speculate, that there was a major Saudi and Emirati role in putting pressure on the Egyptian military not to agree to those confidence-building measures. And one of them, for example, was releasing Katatni from prison and several other senior leaders. So. And then, of course, we all know about Kerry's statements after, and the unwillingness to use aid as a lever. I mean, some aid is suspended now, but that's because of Senator Leahy and not so much because of administration. And it's a very kind of half measure, and it's largely symbolic. Anyway, there's been a lack of real pressure. The EU is also very concerning, that we might have expected the EU to play a more constructive role. But they've in some way been worse. And if you look at their statements, especially the last few months, we've seen a very troubling trend in how they're approaching the Egyptian situation. Okay, so we've gone, those are two. So I guess we're on number three now. So number three is Sisi has popular support. Now, not as much popular support as maybe some people originally thought, and we saw relatively low turnout in the elections. So obviously he doesn't have an overwhelming majority, or perhaps even a majority of support. And certainly there's polls that have come out, the Pew poll, the Zogby poll, that suggests that his support is actually weaker than a lot of people thought. That said, even if it's a minority, there's a very significant large minority that passionately, enthusiastically supports Sisi, or to put it differently, hates the Brotherhood so much that they're willing to embrace Sisi because they just really hate the Brotherhood. So this is different than, say, under Mubarak, where you would never meet people under Mubarak who loved Mubarak or who got very excited about him. Some people said, well, he's better than the alternative, he has 30 years of experience, he's the best, that kind of thing. But you never saw people get really passionate about Mubarak. Sisi is different in that respect, and that's why there's a kind of